So, if we're meditating, this, well, what was the word instead of syllogism? There was some Latin-esque word, enthymeme, something like
Yeah, that's it.
enthymeme. But anyway, we'll call it syllogism. It's sort of like a fake syllogism. The subject, my body, does not inherently exist because of being a dependent arising. Now, the real vegetable, I was going to say meat, the real vegetable, the real vegetarian food, something to chomp on, right, is to establish that my body is a dependent arising. Because you can go, oh yeah, everything's a dependent arising. It's a dependent arising, so, we don't necessarily have to think the subject, my body, right? This thing. These two limbs, two legs, a trunk, which in Indian and Tibetan lore includes the head. But because we've been taught that it's the brain that thinks, we tend to not want to think that the head is and I keep emphasizing this, saying it over and over again, that the head is part of the trunk. Whereas it's a limb as far as the text that we're reading are concerned. Why? Because if you think in your chest, the head is a limb. This thing that flops around. But if you're thinking in your head, well, what do you mean that's a limb? I mean, right? It's part of the trunk. So it's easy to adapt this, whatever way you want to think of it. So 4 limbs in a trunk or 5 limbs in a trunk? So it has parts. So it's dependent arising independence upon its parts. Independence means established, right? Here, dependence means established, right? If you go back and what we've learned about how arising is taken in this, when we're talking about it's established independence upon parts, right? Arising, according to Chandrakirti, is taken as established because it's not that first you have the parts and then body arises, as if that's second. So that's one way that it's dependently established. So my body does not inherently exist because of being a dependent of arising because of being established in dependence upon its parts. Its parts are 5 limbs and a trunk. And then this is a favorite reasoning of Arya Davis, for instance. And so I'm just touching on that. So there's a lot. There's a lot that goes into because of being a dependent arising. So being a dependent arising connects back to my body. Remember, we had my body is a dependent arising. That was one of the 2 points. And whatever is a dependent arising does not inherently exist. Those were the 2 points. And we talked about earlier, what is the order? My body is a dependent arising, and whatever is dependent arising does not inherently exist. Or, what's first? Whatever is a dependent arising does not inherently exist. And second, my body is a dependent arising. The order of realization. Just reviewing some things. So, casting this in meditation, right? Not just topics, but meditation. That's the whole point of this. So putting up above here, I'm ferreting out Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa's thought, putting that first. So, he says, unlike in the autonomy school, but okay, let's follow out the order that he's claiming in the autonomy school, not just claiming, in the autonomy school. So, he says initially, the property of the subject. This is lingo. So, the subject is my body. You're with me now, right? Nobody's lost. But if you're lost, just speak up. There are no dumb questions. Never think that. My body, the subject is my body. You see up top there? The subject, my body. Everything gets rendered, written out, spoken in the form of, in a formal form. So I'm putting it in the formal form. And you can meditate in the formal form too. My body, that's the subject. And independent arising is a property which is in the reason, this property. There's another property which does not inherently exist, but property here refers to the property that's the reason. So my body is dependent arising. That's called property of the subject. So, and such as that, initially the property of the subject is established, proven, if you're meditating, it's to yourself. And so you reflect on a whole bunch of reasons to get it through to yourself that this body is a dependent arising. Arising in dependence on things like water. This is water. My other cup is coffee. Trying to stay away from coffee, at least, so I don't get floody. So initially, property of the subject is established for yourself in meditation, or you debate with somebody else. And that is patiently, with a beautiful teaching from Geshe Genden Lotre. When I first got to meet him in Wisconsin, when he came to visit my aged teacher, not His Holiness, Langdon in Wisconsin, where he was, I can say, tutoring me every day. He was the abbot of the Tantra College, what I call Lower Lhasa, which is a misnomer. But from that Tantra College is so called because of Lothar Rinpoche said, and I couldn't remember what he said after he told me, from that Tantra College was located way out somewhere in the distance. And he had a reason why it was called Lower, which is not Lower Lhasa. I made up that name. So I should just call it Gyume. Now, Genden Lotre came to visit us in Wisconsin. And then I went to visit him in Hamburg, where he had where he was first teaching, where he was teaching and then later became even a full professor, recognized for his extremely great Tibetan scholarship. Anyway, so first, establishing either for yourself or for somebody else through debate. And after that, in order to establish the entailment, which is whatever has been arising necessarily, if we explain it in rough terms, whatever has been arising necessarily is not inherently existent. You can explain it in positive form or in negative form. Whatever has been arising necessarily is not inherently existent. Another way of saying it. So let's see. Not another one. A common locus. Now, this is the academic mode of operation is to take a term like location and use a Latin term, locus. So we may as well scratch locus, the Latin term, which not too many people would understand. It's just like going to the outpatient clinic and a word like cystoscopy. I don't know. I was going to look it up. What either Latin or Greek, term is being used. Scope has to mean look up, look. That part of it. And cyst, whatever that means, could be rendered in English. But they want to couch it in some word that the layperson can't understand. Locus is not that difficult in English. It's not that difficult. But I guess location is just as good. A common location of the sign, dependent arising, and the predicate of what is negated. Well, let's take this apart. We'll get rid of locus and change it common location. Now the sign is dependent arising. What's the sign of Gandhi's being an astute politician when the British were around? When the British were around. How astute he was later is probably a subject of controversy. I mean, he knocked out the British. So I'm sure somebody more familiar with Gandhi's, what is it called? It's active resistance. Active.
Ahimsa.
Yeah, well, now that's using an Indian word. We're trying to speak English. Active,
Nonviolence.
nonviolent resistance. You follow? Active, nonviolent resistance. Active, assertive, nonviolent resistance. Really clever. And the same with Martin Luther King. Active, assertive. Eventually, later in Martin Luther King's life, as far as people were concerned, it had to be violent. He was losing his influence later in his life. And I was part of a committee of mainly Indians, and when they had to choose between Gandhi's program and Buddha's program in his most famous book, translated into English in both its Theravada form and its great vehicle form. These Buddhist Hindus chose Buddha's Dhammapada over Gandhi's politics. Reverting to the spinning wheel and that program. Anyway, that's why I picked the earlier Gandhi. Now, why was I picking? What was my thread there? I've lost my thread. Oh yeah, the signs of his being a wise politician. Okay, sign. I'm just the great importance of the word sign and understanding sign and using sign, which is there in Sanskrit and there in Tibetan. Sanskrit linga, Tibetan da. And the word densik is also there, and in Sanskrit, hetu, there's that word also. Location of sign and predicate of what is negated. Now, we have proposition, and which scholars who translate this material use probandum, the Latin. And for what is negated, they use negandum. We could never really come up with something easy for negandum. And we just used negandum because we didn't want to say what is negated. Well, I say let's use what is negated, unless we can come up with the equivalent of proposition. It would be negation, but negation doesn't seem to work. The predicate of the negation, maybe it works. Maybe we just felt it wouldn't work. Negatum, you know.
Is the proposition the drupja or drupcha?
Drupja.
Drupcha.
And even in Sanskrit and Tibetan, drupcha and drupja are not used entirely distinctively. Not entirely. Occasionally, it's, you have to decide it by context. But let's get rid of the Latin. That's my hallmark, to do that. So I've got to follow my own. The predicate of what is negated.
Could it work to say the thesis and then antithesis?
I've already used that for the Tibetan tamja. I've already used it. So again, my hallmark is to have a different word. If you can come up with a word, I'd really appreciate it. I can see where what is negated easily would be in Tibetan Drupcha. But predicate of what is negated inherently exists. If you look up above, the subject my body does not inherently exist. It would be what is negated is the subject my body inherently exists. That's what you'd plug in there. The predicate of what is negated. Given, should we move inherently exists over there next to predicate? The predicate inherently exists of what is negated. Maybe. Should it be moved? What do you think? The predicate inherently exists of what is negated. Yeah. And so forth. I don't know what and so forth means. Maybe it has to do with the example. I just got that. Because the elements of the example are crucial. It must mean that. Or at least I can't come up with anything else. Oh, I'm happy.
Regarding the common locus and common location, can it be like more English, at least as I understand English, like common ground? Does it work?
Yes. I think you got it. We're getting location coming from locus, rather than,
It's actually closer to the Tibetan a little bit. It's Shitum, but it's more like...
Yeah, she. Common foundation, common... What are our words for she?
Basis.
Basis. Common basis. Well, let's see what works. Common basis. Ground. Yeah. Location seems to be the least. Location almost sounds like where you'd find it. It seems to be the least good of those three. And ground we already use. And since we are most frequent, we use substratum, but that doesn't. Well, okay. So Boris loosened us from from a totally from common locus and working from the Latin to the English. Wonderful. All right, common basis. So
We also have
huh?
definition of that. There's also footing, a common footing of the sign or a common underpinning of the sign.
Yes. The basis has the virtue of coming right off a direct translation from the Tibetan. Yeah, thank you.
And the so forth, do you think it could refer to the Tsema Sum, like the three pramana that are supposed to be the prerequisites for realizing predicate?
Well, I think, offhand, since it's talking about what needs to be
Because here it just mentions one of them, like the Drupjeche, Gakjeche, the Ngungabin Tsema is the only one mentioned, so the Sok might just mean the other two that are left over. Dakitsen Shingi Bitsema Tang. Drupjeche la. Krasa. Tak Drupjeche, Shitu Mibitsema.
Well, put that in as a possibility. Such as in this consequentialist, so, unlike blah blah blah, such as that, in this consequentialist system, the proposition, my body, there's no comma. The proposition, my body, there's no comma, does not inherently exist, is realized while the functioning of just this awareness, ascertaining the proposition in the given proof. That is to say that a stalk, and we're substituting in here because a stalk is so boring, or so what's a shoot or a stalk or however one wants to deal with it. A shoot is used or because it's so neutral, so completely neutral. But if one is going to turn this into meditation, I feel one may as well go ahead and do this with something that is not quite as complex as I. We say, don't tell me. But this becomes a bit too touchy, right? right? A bit too complex. And my body is still complex, but interesting. And fascinating. And you're getting a good picture of my hair. Pandemic hair. I was thinking this is in Sankhya, I think it's Jawa Dun. Sorry, I don't mean to launch into Tibetan. 7 relationships. I think it's 7. I was going to look this up in Jain Sheba's Tenets book. It's really, one could say, talk about interesting, much more interesting in many ways than the Dignaga Dhammakirti 2 relationships. I mean, it's just 2. Sankhya has 7. And one of them is reversion of state. If there's something that, I think it's a leaf, a certain type of leaf that is folded up, it's folded up on itself. And if you stretch it out, it'll fold back, it will revert to its state. It's either a leaf or a type of leather. If you have something that's been folded up for some state, for some length of time, it'll revert back to its state. So when I was in college, I grew long hair that was very curly. And even when I was teaching in Virginia, if you look at some of those videos that Paul Hackett so nicely, really geniusly prepared, I have very curly hair and so forth. And I looked at some of those and I think, oh, that's really nice. And so I took this opportunity to grow my hair long. So this is reversion of state. So we should get out the seven relations that Sankhya has, and have a look at them. So I have this theory that often Indian systems that will take something like the 7 relations, boil them down to 2, and then they will try to get the other 5, the advantages of the other 5, back into their system. Somehow get, right? Between Geluk and Nyingma, you'll find, we, vast differences, and they'll then somehow try to get back into their system something that they'll avidly refute. They'll try to get back into their system. So don't get, I'm controlling myself on the disillusions that take place in highest yoga tantra, for instance. In Nyingma version of Guhya Samaja, or even how some Hindu systems take the lower, in Sankhya, for instance, take the lower levels of mind so-called mind to be material. Anyway, his dominion rise has not deteriorated. What is that? So the functioning of just the awareness ascertaining the property of the subject in the, what did I say? Proof here? Proof here. That was pretty good that I came up with that. I'm proud of myself. No, I'm taking joy in what I came up with. Wow. Maybe I should say that. Instead of throwing in something that in the proof here. In the proof here. That is to say that my body is a dependent arising, just that, has not deteriorated. In other words, you have that the vibrancy of that realization is still there. Thereby the dawning to such an inference of a combination of the two, my body's emptiness of inherent existence. Is that right? No. Yeah. My body's emptiness of inherent existence, which is the proposition, and my body's dependent arising, arises from the power of ascertaining. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Is it?
I think so. Yeah, because they only, they're just,
Right.
they have the property of the subject. But then down lower, the reason they have that is because they've actually already got the syllogism,
The entailment. The entailment?
Yeah, that's why they have it.
So, this is what he has read into, and you can see why he's read into it. For such proponents, the middle one, they explicitly ascertain that internal and external things, like my body, are dependent arisings, contingent. And then I wanted to say, that in Tibetan is rakleba, dependent in Tibetan is demba, reliant is durba, on causes. I've seen this as meaning, right. Thank you, Tarba.
You wrote it.
Well, I don't know. You see, I often feel I didn't write it. In New York, after I read His Holiness's, one of His Holiness's books, I had to be interviewed to be the person who recorded, and I beat out a couple people, including a big actor, to be the person who recorded His Holiness's, a series of His Holiness's books. And sometime later, I spoke with the editor, who wasn't the actual editor, but the person in the hierarchy of the company, the big company. And I said I was even crying when I read. And he said, "What do you mean? You wrote it." I said, "I didn't write it. I was an editor. I said, I never feel like, I'm an extremely conservative editor. Everything is what he said. I mean, he appreciates greatly my editing, as, frankly, His Holiness does. And, when I was reading it, it was so moving. Because, I can hear His Holiness saying these, and I don't put in anything that I say. There's no content of, something I would say. And I said it was bringing tears to my eyes. And he thought, that's ridiculous. I just don't, But, I added these. You can see what I added in brackets. But now I have to look at this and see how I'm going to put in what I just put in, because it's needed. Put it in a note, put something, put a note in beforehand, leave it in the book, don't relegate it to a note, so that it is the reader make sure that it is read, because it needs to be seen. Anyway.
Jeffrey, may I
Yes.
ask a question? I'm just getting pretty confused about what the distinction really is here between the Sautrantika, Prasangika, because this is now talking about someone who's realized emptiness, and they're trying to realize that the stock is empty by the sign of being dependent arising. And so they've already, if they're in that position, haven't they already necessarily realized the absence of a common ground between the sign and the probandum?
Yeah. I think.
Because the only.
Yeah.
Well, together with that, then is the only part that changes of the three pramana that need to precede realizing the proposition, isn't the only one that changes the property of the subject, and the other ones are the same for any whatever the subject would be. So they've already realized them.
I think we're going to have to subject what he says in what Ginninlotra says about the Dignaga Dharmakirti system of debate, and then what this is in meditation, and then what he says about the consequent school. And see if we can figure it out. George Dreyfus, I think I may have mentioned this before. He asked me one day, this is just, we weren't in the debating courtyard. This is just between us. It wasn't something hidden between us. He said, is there any difference between generating an inference by way of a consequence and generating an inference in the usual way? And I just remained silent. I said, I don't know. So I assumed he had gone around and asked a bunch of geishas and couldn't come up with anything. And so now we have Tan-dar-lha-ram-pas. So, I mean, what he's saying is you've already got the entailment firmly in mind. You've already realized emptiness. That realization has not deteriorated somehow. And so the entailment is, one I have to say, is firmly in mind. And, and you reflect on the property of the subject, that whatever it is, that my body is a dependent arising, and with that, the proposition that my body is empty of inherent existence, that combination is together there, is together with in an, I would have to add, in an enhanced way. That's what I would say. And beyond that, I couldn't say anything else. That has to be what Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa is saying.
Can I just ask for one clarification, please? From where do we get that inferential realization of emptiness was already achieved before this reasoning? Maybe I misunderstood something.
What Tsongkhapa says, this is for somebody who has, well, almost all of the scholars that we're about to read in the rest of this book take what Tsongkhapa is saying as meaning for one who has already realized emptiness with valid cognition. I believe either they talk about, or one of them is saying, this occurs for someone who is realizing. But all of them are saying it's subsequent to having realized emptiness with valid cognition. So there's a period of further development after having realized emptiness with valid cognition, that you get an enhancement of realizing emptiness with valid cognition.
But then it seems as if that the first time it has to be realized not through consequence, but through but the other way, like or not. I don't know. It's difficult to see when should it be that that we should say that it was already understood, realized inferentially.
A consequence would be used to break down the pointedness of your belief in the opposite, to break down the pointedness or the cell, the vibrancy, like the strength, where you're set back a little. And then you would use the normal, or the opponent would use the normal statement of the inferential reasoning, or you would use it. But if you're sharp enough, according to the consequence school, the consequence would be sufficient. Oh, that's interesting. If you're sharp enough, the consequence would be sufficient. I have to need to lean over here. The consequence would be sufficient, actually. So it would be further usage of consequences. Further usage of consequences. Okay, I think we have to stop there. Oh, I say, oh, that'll come later, but it doesn't come later. That's pretty funny. Okay, so where are we? So there's a little bit to be said for this to unpack, so we'll stop there. Okay, see you around. Bye.
Thank you.